Let's start with CV curves. So as you're undoubtedly familiar with from Illustrator and other things, you can draw curves by putting down points which get joined together. The basic curve creation in Maya happens by putting down CVs, as I said, control vertices. And it's important to remember that they don't have tangent handles, and the curve interpolation is entirely based on where the points are, as well as the degree of the curve. So let's see how we can actually create a CV curve. I'm going to press spacebar to open up the hotbox, and under the Create menu, which is up at the top, we have Curve Tools, a little sub-menu called Curve Tools, and there's a variety of options. We'll look at a couple of these, but the top one, and the one that I recommend using most often, is the CV Curve tool. We can click on the options box, which is basically just going to bring up the tool settings in the side here. Again, I kind of like the tool settings over on the right, so I'm just going to push them over there. And we talked about degree, the curve degree a little bit earlier, and having the curve degree as 3 or cubic is most often what you want to do. That comes in as default, and that's most commonly used. So in the viewport, all we just do is click, and again, there's no tangent handles. So once we've created 4 CVs, then it actually starts drawing what the actual curve will look like. So I can hit enter to complete the tool and get my finished curve. You'll notice that as I was clicking, all of the CVs were snapped to the grid, so they're sitting on that plane. In order to create CVs that are going to be up in the air, you'll want to use the various top, front, and side view modes. I realize this is a little bit hard to see on this background, so I'm going to hit Alt-B to toggle to, I think that's the default, darker gray, which is a little bit easier to see. Now everybody's going to be Alt-B toggling their various options. That's okay. Okay, so to get into component mode, let's talk about a few of the components of the curve. Again, that's right mouse button, right click to get this little marking menu. And 90, I don't want to say a percentage, but most of the time you're going to be using control vertices. That's the one over on the left, as well as object mode. That's the one over here. So we can go into control vertex mode, and you can see hopefully these purple dots, if you select them, they turn yellow, are the control vertices, and those are the ones that we can move around, and you can see that as we move them, the curve is updated. So we can make a selection, and it's a little hard, it takes a little bit of time to get used to this idea that these points are not sitting on the curve, but you do kind of get used to it. And you've always got the feedback from actually seeing the curve move. The start of the curve has a little bit of an interesting, instead of having these round dots elsewhere, you've got this little U shape and a little box, and those are the first 2 CVs of an actual curve. So that kind of helps you define where the start of the curve is and where the end of the curve is. And there is directionality to a curve, which can be important in a few different circumstances. So there is another, I really enjoy marking menu, and I'm just going to go a little bit overboard at this point here, but there are a variety of marking menu types that do various things, and so at this point I'm just going to do a very brief summary. So if you do command right mouse button, command right click, you get a different marking menu, and that's going to help you change the selection. So you can immediately select the first CV, and you can go down and immediately select the last V, and that's helpful. The command right click marking menus are all about changing the selection, modifying your selection, and I'll let you explore how that works when you're working with polygon meshes. The regular right mouse button gives you access to different component types as well as object mode. That's kind of a universal thing. And the shift right mouse button, or the shift right click, which we've seen many times, gives you access to different tools and commands that are relevant to whatever you have selected. If you do that here, nothing will come up because they've decided not to build a marking menu. You could as well, if you're adept at scripting and you really like to do that sort of thing, you could make your own marquee menu. But just as a general rule of thumb, regular right mouse, different component types, command right mouse or control if you're on Windows will allow you to change your selection. Shift right mouse will give you access to different tools and commands. And command shift right mouse button will allow you to change the settings of the current tool, like your move manipulator. But for now, maybe it's simpler just to do that one in the actual toolbox. Okay, enough about marquee menus. Let's carry on with these curves. So, whoops. What you don't want to do is go over to this cluster, because that creates a cluster deformer on all of the CVs, and that's not really useful at this point. So don't do that. I'm going to go back into object mode. We've also got the edit point, and the edit points are like CVs, except that they sit on the curve, and again, they're a derivative of how the curve is in the space. It might feel more intuitive to use the edit points to manipulate the curve, and when you're creating a curve, you can use the EP curve tool, that's short for edit point curve tool, to create a curve like this where the curve goes through the edit points. It'll essentially create the same, another curve, another CV curve. So if I go into the EP curve tool and start putting down edit points, and if I hit enter, I could go into control vertex mode, and it's the same thing, right? It's just that the control vertices define where the curve goes and the edit points sit on the curve. The reason that the edit points are a little bit funny, and I don't really recommend using them, is that they have a longer area of influence. So you can see when I'm moving around these edit points, you can see that the curve is really being adjusted all the way along the length, and that's because the curve sort of function has to be updated to allow the curve to go through the points. Whereas if you're just modifying a CV, you can see that it's much more of a local change. So if you had a complex curve and you were really happy with, you had spent a lot of time tweaking this area of the curve, and you just needed to tweak this area of the curve, you'd want to use control vertices, because the edit points would change, would modify slightly much more of the curve. We can insert more CVs, more curves, if you need more resolution to manipulate a small portion of the curve. We can do that, and it's a little bit of a strange workflow to do this, but basically we go into curve point mode. And a curve point will allow you to click anywhere on the curve and select a point, and it doesn't have any sort of pre-existing, it's not a pre-existing component. Basically all that's doing is telling you where you want to insert, for our purposes, where you want to insert a CV. So you can hold down the shift button and add more of them. And so let's say I've got these curve points. Then I can actually do the shift right mouse button and do insert not or detach curve, and those will detach the curve at those points, or insert CVs at those points. You can also do that. There's a whole curves menu. So in the modeling menu set here in the middle, we've looked at some of the mesh and edit mesh tools. There's also one called curves, and that's got a whole, it's going to go off the screen, a whole bunch of commands and tools. Let's see if I can go a little bit higher so you can see. So here's the insert not. And so if I click on that one, insert not, we get jumped back into object mode, but if we go into the CV mode, you can see that the CVs have been added. And right now it looks like they're sitting on the curve, and they kind of are, but if we pulled them off, you can see that they behave like any of the other CVs. There's also the add points tool, which sounds like it might do the same thing, but all that does is allow you to add to the end of the CV curve. So if you weren't quite finished, you can carry on adding points that way. Okay, so that's a little bit about CV curves. The last thing I want to talk about with CV curves is the degree. So when we are creating a CV curve, let's go back into the curve tools and the options. Again, we can create a linear curve, and in that case, the curve is going to be linearly interpolated between the points. So if you just wanted a spiky curve or a blocky curve for whatever reason, that's how you can create a linear one or a 1 degree curve. Okay. So very briefly, the Bezier tool, the Bezier curve, again, very much like Illustrator, it works by just clicking and dragging out those tangent handles. And if you have the tool settings open, you've got a bunch of really sort of helpful hotkeys. You can hold down the control, like they've got control and left mouse button will reset the anchor tangents. Control shift will close the curve. Control left mouse will break the tangency. So if we sort of are clicking on one of these, we can break the tangency, like you can do with the pen tool and Illustrator, a lot of those sorts of things. So that might seem a lot more versatile, and it might be more versatile. But what's interesting to note is that it's almost like, it's not quite like, but it's almost like if you compare it to a CV curve, that not only are the regular anchor points here CVs, but the tangent handles are also CVs. So it kind of behaves like that. And when you're doing some operations on these Bezier curves, it will sort of behave like each of the tangent handles is yet another CV. So I'll leave it up to you whether you want to use Bezier curves or CV curves, and you can convert between them. But my preference is the CV curves because they're a little bit more, they're a little bit simpler, and they behave a little bit more understandably when it comes to certain operations, I find at least. All right, let's get rid of some of these curves. I'm going to leave the degree 1 curve here for a little demo of conversion. So in addition to, so I'll just show you the convert. Is that gonna go off the screen? I'm gonna modify, convert, and then you've got the NURBS curve to Bezier and the Bezier curve to NURBS. And I believe that's they're calling it a NURBS curve. That's the CV curve. There's also under the curves menu something called rebuild, and this is definitely going off the screen. Let's see if I can. Curves, rebuild. So that, if I go into the option box, the rebuild, that's going to rebuild the curve with some new settings. And there's a lot of things you can do with it. I'm just going to reset the settings here. But some of the simplest things are to change the degree. So let's say we've made it a degree 1 curve, but we want to convert that to a cubic. We can keep the ends, which means keep the ends in place. We can also keep the CVs that we've got, the existing CVs we want to do, but we just want to make it a degree 3 curve. We can also keep the original and just make a duplicate, or we can delete the original and just keep the new one. So I'm going to do that. And you can see here that the CVs are sitting in the same spot, but now we've got a nice smooth curve. So that's like that. What we can also do, I'll reset the settings here, is instead of changing the degree, we can actually just change the number of CVs that actually define this curve. So we could simplify a curve, or we could add a whole bunch more resolution in order to make it more versatile for whatever we're doing. So I could change the number of spans, and a span essentially is, I think I have this right, a span is the region between 2 CVs. I kind of feel like I don't have that quite right, but that's a rough approximation. So let's just say if I've got 4, that would simplify the curve. Sorry, I have to make sure I'm in object mode and have it selected. I'll hit apply. You can see that the curve has been simplified, and now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, the span is a little bit more complex. I think it's the region between 3 CVs. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not sure. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. But we could do this. We could do say 24 CVs or spans, and then when we go into control vertex, then we've got a much more complex curve that allows us to do more with it. So that's rebuilding a curve, and that's useful in many scenarios. Okay, so enough about curves. Let's talk about NURBS surfaces. I'm gonna delete that So in addition to these polygon primitives, we also have NURBS primitives. We can create NURBS either with these NURBS primitives or by creating those curves and doing operations on them to create NURBS surfaces. But let's just start with a torus. Okay. And if it comes in kind of blocky, there are the 1, 2, and 3 keys on the keyboard will define how smooth the torus appears in the viewport. It's important to note that this is not changing the degree. This isn't a degree 1 NURBS surface and a degree 2 NURBS surface and a degree 3 NURBS surface. This is just a representation of the display. The degree, you can change the degree of the NURBS surface, but that happens differently. So that's just an important point. But I'll hit 3 keys so that I've got the smooth version of it. And one immediate benefit of NURBS over polygons is that you can see that you've got much less faceting by default. And indeed, when you render it, you can get things that are perfectly smooth because they're mathematically, it's like vector versus, it's kind of analogy is a vector representation versus pixel representation. One of them is kind of resolution dependent, one of them is not. So I told you that NURBS surfaces are 4-sided patches, or they're made up of 4-sided patches. Does anybody believe that this is essentially just a flat piece of paper? Well, I can show you under the creation settings that we can open it up, and we can open it up this way. And now it's pretty easy to see that, yes, this is just a 4-sided patch. And all that it's done is just swept it around this axis and then sweep it around that axis, and we've got our full torus. So these creation settings are useful. Again, we can change the degree, so that is a linear degree 1 NURBS surface. And if we hit 1, 2, and 3 on the keyboard, it doesn't do anything, right? Because that's different from changing the degree. So if we're in cubic degree, then we can change the preview smoothness. Okay, so right clicking to get that, again, the component, changing the component marking menu. We've got the control vertices, and again, like the CV curves, these CVs are sitting offset from the surface. So it's a little bit hard to see how they're going to influence the surface, but we get that feedback when we're selecting the CVs and moving them. The hulls are hull mode. If we go over to hull mode, that's a much easier way to select a loop of CVs. So we can just, you don't even have to double click. You just single click on one of those and you get all of the CVs there. And that makes it a little bit more easy to edit. So you can do various things with the hulls. And we talked, I think, about pick walking in the context of hitting the up arrow on the keyboard, the up arrow to go up a hierarchy. Pick walking also works in component mode, and particularly with NURBS and curves, we can use the arrow keys to sort of change our selection. So if we hit up on the keyboard, then we can cycle through these rows of CVs or these hulls. And I'm just hitting up, and we can kind of loop through, and that's a nice way. Let's say if we wanted to sort of change the profile of this really quickly, we can just modify it and just use the arrow keys to sort of go around. Now, if we were selecting the other direction, and again, I'm not entirely, I can take a guess. I think this is the V direction. Remember, we had the U direction, which I think is around this way, and the V direction, which I think is around this way. And so you can use the left and right arrow keys to sort of change your selection through the V direction. Or it might be U, I'm not sure. And it's a little hard to check. I'm sure there's ways to check which direction it is. But basically the left and the right and the up and the down will allow you to change your selection. Okay, so that's pick walking and hulls. And so isoparms, I said in the lecture before that isoparms they look like they're kind of edges, but if you hit the move tool, you can't do anything. You might get this red sort of line, but you're not actually moving anything. So what are they good for? Well, they're like curve points that we looked at on the CV curve, and in the sense that if you click on an isoparm and drag it out somewhere else, or click on an isoparm and drag it out, and you can shift. You can do shift to drag out multiple dotted lines, like so. So I've got these dotted lines, and those are a preview of where new resolution can be added. So now we can go to the surfaces menu, which is right beside the curves menu, and we can, where is it? I always forget. So we can go down to insert isoparms. And if we do that, then we have more resolution, and if we go into control vertex mode, then we have CVs that are associated with those new isoparms, and that's given us more stuff to work with. It is, I don't want to call it edge loop because it's technically not an edge loop, but it's functionally it's quite similar to inserting an edge loop, yes. So the last thing I want to talk about, with polygon primitives, we have normals. We've talked about normals, and that's kind of the direction that a face is facing, essentially. Surfaces are similar in that there's a front side and a back side, and if I sort of, let's make a new, let's make a cylinder here. No, that's a polygon cylinder. That's not what I want to do. It's NURBS cylinder. You can see that the NURBS cylinder doesn't have a cap. There's ways you can make a cap, but the primitive version of this only has just the outside ring, and we can change the sweep. So we've got basically the correct side of it and the incorrect side of it, and if we've got our two-sided lighting off, which I recommend, you can see which is the correct side and the incorrect side. So in order to reverse this, let's say we made something and it was facing the wrong way. Instead of reversing the normals, which you do with polygon objects, what we do with surfaces is called reversing the surface direction. So under the surfaces menu, and this is off the screen again, but at the very, very bottom, we've got a menu command called reverse direction. And we can reverse it in the U or the V or swapping or bothing, but for the most part, if you just leave it at the default, swapping or reversing the U direction, what's going to happen is it's going to be drawing it in essentially the curves in the other direction, and so the correct surface is going to be facing the other way. So if I hit G, I'm going to repeat that process, and I'm sort of back to where we were at the beginning. So if you ever see a surface that's facing the wrong way, the command, the reverse direction, is going to be helping. There's a lot more that we could talk about with NURBS, but with our limited time, just the basics I think are going to suffice. And if you want to explore more, there's lots more to do. So next up, we're going to do a little walkthrough, making some lab equipment with NURBS.